idea of great, recording's underway. And if you're joining us and watching the recording, rest assured you haven't missed anything important. I've just run through the introductions and the focus of today's webinar, which is really encapsulated on slide number 4 here. But yes, certainly let me know if you're where you're from, and if you know what sort of organisation you're from. It'd be great to get an idea of who's in the room and what type of organisations people are from. So we're getting some sort of community not-for-profits. We might have some local government people on board, or other government-based businesses, incorporated association, yep, so not-for-profit as well. Yeah, so far we're really getting the community NFPs and some people being a bit more specific around that we come from an incorporated association. So that's fantastic, and welcome to you all. Getting a couple of councils as well. So welcome to you all. So we're going to start off, as I've said, by talking about the aged care big picture. And for me, this is sort of encapsulated by the idea that we're going to fly the helicopter. You know, like I said, we're not going to be down talking about the grass clippings from the lawnmower, or you perhaps say that the superfine detail of aged care reform. We're going to take a really high level view of what's happening in the aged care industry. And obviously part of that is Meals on Wheels. But before I talk about the big picture, I just wanted to get a sense of what's something you see or that you deal with that's external to your organisation. What sort of a driver, a force, something that's impacting your organisation externally. And if you wanted to have any ideas on that, just put them in the chat, and we'll see. You know, I'm sure there's a bit of overlap between the things that I see and want to talk about, and no doubt what you practically experience on the ground, like what affects your organisation that comes from the external world. So some of the big external drivers, forces and trends that we see at ASSPL and regularly talk about are encapsulated in the model here. And some of these you might recognise yourself. Things like, well, the population is ageing. People are living at home longer. And that also means they're living at home longer with greater acuity, greater medical need, and also more chronic and complex health conditions. Also, the expectations of older people are changing, what they need and want, or that could be the expectations and needs of their family as well. We're increasing operating in competitive marketplaces, or there's various forms of commercialisation and corporatisation happening, or governments using tender and grant processes to drive more commercialisation and corporatisation. So that generally results in greater competition. And therein, whilst industry is consolidating, move down to the bottom of my model, you know, we get less and less organisations, but delivering more and more services. At the same time, there's new entrants to the market. We've got innovative service and business models, care technology. We've got the government and the public expecting more of organisations, and the volume of legislation, regulations and rules is increasing dramatically. And I think that's even more acute or obvious in human services like aged care, disability, childcare, where the government funds us or funds the client, and therefore they put a whole range of rules around that. And the government's driving financial efficiency. And these are all important to understand, and we will cover some more in detail. Things like the paradigm shift in aged care. We'll look at how home care in a broad sense has changed. We'll look at how the government has shifted service delivery to Royal Commission. So we'll look at a few more of these in detail in a moment, but really understanding and addressing these external drivers, forces and trends is really critical for your board and your other organisational leaders, because it helps you respond more effectively to the new act and the reform. It'll help you if you're doing support at home as well, in terms of the detailed rules. It'll help you develop and deliver new service or business models. It can help you with your business growth and success, working on your financial viability and sustainability. And essentially, they're a critical part of whether you're working in the business to deliver services, whether you're working on the business to improve its processes or its people, or whether you're transforming your business and working on new service or business models. None of that can happen in isolation from what is going on externally to you. So let's dive in then and have a bit more of a detailed look at the idea of the paradigm shift in human services. Many organisations today grew up in what we'd call the government-funded welfare paradigm. Typically, the government would fund you in advance. There'd be very certain funding or guaranteed funding over a very long number of years. And organisations were typically smaller with a focus on the service or the individual. But since about 2000, both at the state and Commonwealth level and broadly worldwide, you've seen governments increasingly move human services delivery into what we'd call the customer-driven competitive market paradigm. So in this paradigm, typically, as long as you're sort of registered and meet the boxes to enter the system, tick, 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 anyone can deliver services. You've got to win customers. You bill them in arrears, so you've got to deliver up front first. So there's some small comparisons, but really this idea that we've moved from one paradigm, from the government-funded welfare paradigm to the customer-driven competitive market paradigm, will really underpin the next few slides and a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So there's been a shift in the rules. There's been a shift in the way you're expected to operate. There's been a shift in who's operating in the marketplace and how they do that. And to provide you with some more sort of concrete examples of that, what has that meant for in-home care broadly? So when I say in-home care broadly, I'm not just talking about CHISP and meals. I'm also talking about packages or what will soon become support at home, other forms of in-home care. So it's a bit of a broader umbrella. But in the past, there was going way back before my time, there was probably little support in the home, and over the previous decades, there's been more and more growing support. And now the government's actually looking to actively support people in their homes and keep them at home longer. One, because people want to, but two, it actually costs the government less than funding residential aged care. And the imminent future and going forward, we're seeing increasing telehealth and telecare, albeit that how developed organisations are in that space really depends on their capacity and capability. But another one, looking at my third one down, in the past we had services funded and clients were allocated to you. So it's sort of like, this is our region, you come to us, and CHISP still operates in that model somewhat. But over time, we've had increasing client choice and control. And as we've moved into managed marketplaces, we've had models where the client is assessed, the client gets funding matched to their care plan, and then they choose an organisation available in their region to deliver that service. So that's a dramatic shift in how we gain clients. We've also, as that example of increasing legislation and regulation in home care, in the past, second from the bottom, we had guidelines and standards. But then we moved to the home care common standards, to the single aged care quality standards. And at that point, CHISP got drawn in as well through the grant process of having to, or through the grant agreement of having to meet the aged care standards. And now we're moving on to another set or another level of standards, the strengthened aged care standards, which put that emphasis on clinical care to a greater extent, client centricity, and some of those concepts you'd be familiar with. And just to touch on the last point on this slide down the very bottom, in the past, what happened in the home was mainly low care. I mentioned this again, but just to emphasize it, I think it's a critical point. There was very limited sort of high care. Increasingly over time, the spectrum of low to high care has grown, even subacute care. And today, and going forward, really people are actually what's on the in the red circle there at the very bottom says high care to subacute, but really people are living in their homes from self-care to low care right through to subacute and palliative care. And now some of you, if you're running some sort of mixed service model, not just Meals on Wheels and shifts, you might be involved in some of that care. But even if you're just purely running a Meals on Wheels service, I no doubt would have seen you're getting clients who are living at home longer, experiencing greater fragility as they age, increasing chronic and complex health, and increasing acuity. And that recognition, or that is part of what is driving the government really around making all registered organisations or registered providers, which you will become one, or should have become one, I said, on the 1 July, the requirements around care planning in November when it starts, risk management and incident management reporting. So they're trying to recognise that even if we're just delivering a meal, we're ultimately dealing with more and more with people who have chronic and complex health and greater acuity. I should have said as well, if you've got questions as you go, feel free to drop them in the chat because I will keep an eye on that. But moving on then to say, well, the nature of government, the nature of service delivery has changed, and that is predominantly operates or has happened around the idea of this managed marketplace. So in the past, on the left-hand side, whether it was local, state or Commonwealth governments, they both legislated and regulated, they funded and financed, they monitored and reviewed the outcomes, and they also undertook service delivery. But through the use of the managed marketplace, and especially at the Australian government level, they're saying, well, we'll legislate and regulate, we'll fund and finance, we'll monitor and review, but ultimately we're going to have a whole range of different organisational types undertake service delivery, whether that's private companies, proprietary limiteds, whether that's those listed on the stock exchange, Australian and international, what I would call community businesses, or what you might call a not-for-profit. And also there's still a range of government businesses or government organisations in the care game. And typically that is local government, or they are increasingly getting out. And there's also some, especially in Victoria, state government is still heavily in the residential side, and some home care. So the role of government has fundamentally shifted, and that page just talks through that at a later date if you want to go over it. So that raises the question, well, why does the government operate a managed marketplace model? Why are they moving home care to an even greater focus on the managed marketplace model? And essentially they talk about 4 reasons. Efficiency, or these are the reasons they believe the managed marketplace is appropriate. Now, up front, whether that's right or wrong, we can have a debate about at another time. I suppose I'm not here to advocate to say it's right or wrong, but this is ultimately what the government is doing. Therefore, if you want to respond effectively as an organisation, you need to understand this external context. But so they use it as a mechanism, just the managed marketplace, to drive efficiencies, innovation, increase quality, and also customer choice and control or competition. And I do have on this slide pack here, there's just two recent examples that I found in the Support at Home document, where it was really clear, and the government's clearly sending a signal about the efficiency drive they are on through the funding model. The home care package program has a history of high overhead costs charged by some providers, i.e. we're not getting value, we're paying too much, and we want to pay less. And many in the industry sort of lauded the Independent Hospital and Aged Care Pricing Authority pricing services, because it was seen as, well, it's going to be independent, it won't just be government setting the price. But you come back to, where does IHACPA come from? Well, they want to provide advice that will support the policy objectives of the program to deliver higher quality in-home aged care services. Tick, that sounds lovely, but they also want to improve the sustainability of the aged care system and increasing efficiency over time. So again, really clear messages about the efficiency drive and the greater value for money government wants to obtain from organisations who essentially deliver services on their behalf. And just a quick example, I suppose, for those of you, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the home care packages program and Support at Home, and so they're great examples as well, where a managed marketplace model is being used by the government. But the other one people are really familiar with is the NDIS. And so in all those programs, as I've already outlined, really customers are assessed, they have a care plan, and they have funding attached to that plan, and then organisations compete to attract and retain customers. So customers ultimately, within the bounds of what organisations are available in their area, make a choice about who they want to deliver their services. And once those services are provided, the government pays the organisation in arrears for work completed. Super high level and quick, because we've got a lot to get through, but the government typically goes through phases to create a managed marketplace. Entry phase on the left-hand side of my diagram, lots of new providers can enter. There's a qualifying phase where typically the market or the number of organisations will peak, and then you move into the provider phase. So that sort of bell curve model, and you've seen that's been run across childcare, aged care, employment, disability services, disability, and the list goes on of government-funded services, mainstream employment as well. And really what drives from the top of the qualifying to the bottom of the preferred provider phase is government reform, policy, and key drivers. So you can see down the bottom there, the arrows coming up, things like, entry criteria, reforms and policies, tenders, licenses, contracts, increasing standard and accreditation, increasing expectation performances, new funding models that drive efficiency harder. And again, the cycle comes on, new standards, increasing KPIs, and a focus on outputs and outcomes. So those are all kind of drivers that affect providers in the marketplace. And just some quick numbers for those of you who aren't familiar with them. Home care in all its forms is the second row there. Those numbers are a little out of date. Last time I had a conversation with someone and saw the numbers, I think the number of CHIS providers is now down below 1,200. So you're seeing this happen. It's not just the support at home or the home care package program where these drivers are pushing organisations and causing consolidation. You see this same thing happening in the CHIS program as well. And there's some other numbers you can look at there over time if they're of interest to you. But essentially what the managed marketplace and the government funding models do is you're living on fixed income over rising costs, and that inevitably causes margins or profit squeeze. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of, well, at some point, the CPI was 2% or 3% or 4%. And what did the government give us as a funding increase? Well, maybe it was 0.5, it was 1, it was 2. But rarely does government actually match the full CPI increase of what's going on around us, which essentially causes that squeeze on margins, while at the same time we're highly legislated and regulated, we're highly labour intensive and highly capital intensive. And again, they're sort of all somewhat external, some internal, and at the same time often we're seeing client over-servicing. You might be cross-subsidising between services if you run more than one, and there's a range of organisational inefficiencies. So you might be asking yourself, well, ultimately, how do I get out of this triangle, this business and service model, and how do I build something else? Whether it's a diamond, a double helix, a square, is there a different way? And we'll get to that in due course. This is just a pictorial representation. You see essentially more smaller providers, less smaller providers, I should say, sorry, more regional or multi-regional providers, the growth in statewide, and even the growth in national providers as essentially the market consolidates and there's movements made through mergers, acquisitions, networks, growth. And it's quite a dynamic, much more dynamic than it was in the past, whereas it was much more stable. There was this organisation in this region and that was it. And ultimately for me, this leads to the question about, we're saying we've moved from the government-funded welfare paradigm to the customer-driven competitive market paradigm. And for CHIS, that will happen even harder if the government brings you in to support at home in 2027 as planned. I know, many people are really questioning that move, and it's a lot of detail to see how that plays out. But ultimately, if that happens, CHIS will be moved in even harder from the government-funded welfare paradigm to the customer-driven competitive market paradigm, which really raises the question, well, is your organisation adapted to a new world and a new way of operating? Because ultimately, if you operated in the government-funded welfare paradigm, your organisation was perfectly adapted to that environment. The mentality, approach, the way you undid your governance, your organisational structures, systems, processes, your whole service, business and financial models were all 110% geared to that government-funded welfare paradigm, its rules and its ways of operating. And the paradigm, the move to the customer-driven competitive market paradigm, essentially represents a completely different way of working, a resetting of the rules, a new set of rules. And so to operate in that customer-driven competitive market paradigm, I'd put you that organisations ultimately have to transform themselves. You've got to change your mentality and approach. You've got to change your governance. You've got to have an organisational structure that is lean, efficient, and fit for the new way, different systems and processes, and increasing digitisation, and ultimately a whole new service, business, and financial model. I won't touch on this slide for too long, but essentially, in the realm of innovation, the managed marketplace does allow new service, business, financial models to enter the market, people to work in different ways, and predominantly they're all around financial models. Now, some of these have been more accessible than others, but ultimately they are entering the market looking to win market share or change the way care is delivered. And just a reminder as well about the Aged Care Royal Commission as a big picture driver, force or trend, because ultimately it equals really high level the current reform agenda. Now, I acknowledge the current reform agenda doesn't match exactly what the Aged Care Royal Commission called for, but it's basically the blueprint that the reform comes off. And the reason I think that remembering the reform is a result of the Aged Care Royal Commission is really important, because the Aged Care Royal Commission ultimately came about because there was a result of boards and management teams to recognise their organisation was dealing with elderly people who were ageing with chronic and complex health conditions. So ultimately, lots of boards and other leaders didn't really understand the nature of the person they were focused on. Even in like residential care, where it's been acute for far longer, and in the home care packages program, there were many leaders who ultimately sort of saw what they did as, oh, you know, it's all sort of nice cups of tea, cucumber sandwiches, and helping out the elderly. But at the heart, the nature of the person they were looking after and responsible for was chronic and complex health, aging, increasing acuity. And all those care failures, along with a whole bunch of media coverage, political and community pressure, led to the establishment of the Aged Care Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission said, oh, look, there's a whole lot of problems in regulation, funding, staff, provider systems, board and senior team attitudes, workplace practices, cultural problems, and on the list went. It was pretty extensive. But my key message here is, don't forget that leaders have missed before or misunderstood before the nature of the people they operate. Never lose sight of the fact that at the core, the people you assist, they are aging in their own home. They'll have increasing chronic and complex health conditions, and over time, increasing acuity. I know it's not everyone, especially in the CHISP and meal space. There's probably a far bigger spectrum, but the new regulations and the rules coming in 1 November are essentially aimed at driving boards and leaders, you know, things like care planning, greater risk management, greater incident management, are looking for you to drive a new way and have a greater focus on the client who has an increasing acuity. And the intent of those reforms is essentially better aged care services, better standard of care, greater choice and control, service options and pathways, support to stay independent at home, and access to services that respect your client needs and are culturally safe. And I raise this because I think this is, I suppose, a really good kind of set of criteria. By ultimately, as you respond to aged care reform, you respond to the big picture driving forces and trends, you strengthen your organisation, whatever your strategy is going forward, you can ultimately come back to you and say, well, in addressing this change, how have we performed as an organisation against this criteria? And for those of you who aren't familiar, if I got some high-level buckets, what does reform look like? Again, each of these has a whole lot of significant detail I'm not going to talk about, but you know, the sort of the major pillars for in-home care providers as part of the big picture of aged care is that new rights-based act, strengthen standards, you know, more rules essentially, but ultimately with a focus on trying to improve care quality. Over time, moving to a single home care program. So we've already brought home care packages and restorative care together, and there's that indicative July 2027 deadline for CHISP to come into that program as well. Back on the left-hand side in the middle, more reporting to the regulator and trying to give clients or potential clients more information to make informed choices about care quality or about organisations and their care quality. They've increased the number of home care places. We've moved to a single assessment system where theoretically a single workforce should be using a single set of tools to determine whether you need CHISP, home care packages or support at home or residential care. Back on the left-hand side again, at the bottom, we're seeing increasing use of quality indicators and benchmarking, and there is being work done around that in the in-home space as well. It's just a little bit not as advanced as what they do in residential care, but it will come. We've seen strengthened aged care regulator with more powers and greater scope to intervene and direct organisations. And a really important one, which I'd encourage you to look at in more detail if you haven't already, is really strengthening board governance and leadership. So expecting more of boards and their accountability for what happens in their organisations. So we've covered a whole range of what I call big picture drivers, forces and trends, whether they're drivers, pressures, forces, they're all impacting your organisation. And I think often the impact or the pressure those external factors can put on leaders really leads them to grapple with these three questions around, well, how do we ensure that we can provide to clients, to community, high quality, safe and affordable services? that meet their needs or expectations. Second question, well, how do we remain viable, sustainable and profitable, able to fund our strategies and projects, and really continue to exist as an organisation, especially in light of some of those financial trends I spoke about. And ultimately, how do we continue to contribute to the economic development, community development and regional development of the towns, regions or communities we're in? Because as I've already emphasised at the start, the Meals on Wheels services and even CHIST more broadly, there's a really important contribution to community beyond just the meal or the singular service that your organisations provide. So how do we continue to continue that contribution in light of these massive external pressures, which often at times I think are placing huge pressure on organisations and leaders, and ultimately for some of them leading to organisational demise. Now, I did have a table activity, and we're not at tables today, but I'll put it down as a bit of homework and encourage you to answer this question post-session and discuss in an appropriate forum, such as your board meeting or your senior team meeting, or even just amongst colleagues when there's an opportunity, is thinking about, well, from everything Aaron's heard, everything Aaron's spoken about, and everything we know about what happens in the industry, what's one big picture driver, force, or trend impacting on our organisation? And ultimately, how could we as leaders or a team respond more effectively to it? And if you've got any thoughts on that already, feel free to put them in the chat. But ultimately, how do you turn this information about the big picture big picture forces into practical action in your organisation? It's great to hear me talk about them, but ultimately we need to practically address them, in the boardroom, in the senior team, and out on the floor. So that was our first section, the big picture, drivers, forces and trends. Now, we've also then moving on to, well, where's governance come from? Where is it today? And where's it going to go tomorrow? And we're ultimately going to start this discussion on governance by having a crash course in what is corporate governance and what's the governing body's roles and responsibilities. So I've got on the slide there, again, by what I call entity types, whether it's local government, company limited by guarantee, proprietary limited or incorporated association. Many of you, when we said earlier who's in the room, there's quite a few incorporated associations, and some of you may have also been company limited by guarantee. They're both forms of not-for-profits. And the right-hand side of the table will tell you, well, who's our governing body? So you can cast your eye over that list, and it might help you identify who's our governing body, who's Aaron talking about in our organisation for the next sort of 25 minutes or so. Because ultimately, your governing body, whether it's one of those types on the right there, or you've got some other entity type and governing body name I haven't listed, ultimately the governing body is the group of people with overall responsibility for the organisation, and they should ultimately be accountable for its performance, whether that's financial, care, customer outcomes, quality, and on the list goes. And this is one way in which the aged care regulation has been increasing boards, is the standards, the legislation is increasingly recognising the role of the governing body and saying, oh, hang on, there's this group of the people at the top of the tree who are ultimately responsible for the organisation. How do they ensure organisational performance? And we'll see how that plays out in a bit more detail. So then we go, okay, we know who our governing body is. What are their roles and responsibilities? And now the framework I'm going to present does come out of sort of more corporate context or organised private context, but it's definitely applicable across any organisational type, whether that's not-for-profits, local government and their councillors, private companies, public companies, and on the list goes. So albeit depending on your entity type, there might be specific legislation that may add or require other specific things by a governing body. So you can think of this as a broad framework for all governing bodies or boards, whichever word you want to use. And so people typically define corporate governance as a system of rules, practices, and processes by which an organisation is directed and controlled, and also about how the governing body's authority is exercised. Ultimately, the governing body rarely does everything. They delegate or allow others to do things in the organisation. So that's a really common definition, but not one I find actually gives a lot of clarity on the practical roles and responsibilities of the board or what sort of the scope of what they do. So my much more preferred framework is saying, well, first and foremost, governing body should be acting in the best interests of the organisation and also acting in the best interests of internal and key external stakeholders. And certainly that second point about in key external stakeholders, again, aged care legislation and regulation has really kind of latched onto that and said, well, you as a governing body need to be making decisions in the best interests of your consumers, clients, customers, whatever you call them, and ultimately making decisions that provide for the delivery of high quality care and services. And then we talk about 4 responsibilities, being proactive and forward-looking in strategic leadership and policy-based decision-making, and being more reactive or rearward-looking is saying monitoring, reviewing what's happened in the past, how did we go as an organisation, and also ensuring we've got compliance wrapped up and we've got coverage of that so we can prove it through documentation. And again, compliance and coverage is another key example of where legislation and regulation is increasing for aged care organisations in all program or service types, because ultimately there's more rules, more reporting, and more things you're expected to do, and probably feels like on the same or a smaller budget. So what do some of these things look like practically? I'll step through these high level quickly. In terms of the compliance and coverage function, well, it's about knowing what local, state or Commonwealth legislation and regulation do we as a board or does our organisation have to meet? And then we've got processes or assurances in place that we do meet those legislations, or we can apply the same to the quality system and government standards. What's the standard we have to meet and how do we know we as an organisation meet it? Monitoring and reviewing function is pretty much as it sounds, whether it's a monthly or quarterly basis, what are the agreed categories of measurement, be it finances, quality, strategy, contractual outcomes, or importantly in your case, care or services outcomes, and how do we meet those against our agreed indicators, targets or ratios, what does success look like and did we meet that success? And typically for a governing body, there's that traditional role of the appraisal of the Chief Executive Officer's performance. What are policy-based decisions? Well, it's essentially saying we have a range of policy positions as an organisation, whether that's at the governance level, the organisational level, the service level, and when key decisions or decisions have to be made, our decisions are made consistent with that policy. And in terms of the role of the governing body in that space, typically the review and improvement and the making of decisions is against the Constitution and the governance policy and procedure. But I'll leave you to read that in more detail if you want. But the final one, which is probably the most important for the remainder of this presentation and Thursday's session, is understanding strategic leadership. What's the role of your board or your committee of management, your governing body, in how does it fulfill strategic leadership, or what is it? So if we break it down, we'd say, well, strategic's relating to the identification of long-term goals or aims and how we achieve this, and leadership in an organisational context is about influencing and empowering others to contribute or succeed to organisational goals, and therefore as an organisation we have success. Because as I've already mentioned, ultimately you wouldn't typically see the governing body doing all the service delivery, albeit that may be more common in quite small meal services where there's typically not an extensive organisation. But as a generalisation, the board's not doing the service delivery, they rely on others to do that for them. And other ways people talk about strategic leadership, keepers of vision, mission, values, and really keeping the organisation in mission mode, that whether that's growing service types or strengthening and developing organisational processes. We might for a limited time be in maintenance mode, much the same, but we don't want to let our organisation fall into muddling mode. We're going backwards in client numbers, we've got decreasing revenues, we've got cultural problems, quality problems in service delivery, all could be indicators that we're actually in muddling mode and going backwards as an organisation. Our committee of management or our board hasn't kept us in mission mode, growing and developing, looking forward. And typically you see strategic leadership sort of play out through the strategy process. And there's some key elements of that, what that looks like here. The big picture we've talked about, where's our organisation at today at strategic position, get other people's perspectives, undertake strategic thinking discussion, develop the plan, implement the strategic plans. That's sort of the common process by which strategic leadership is practically applied, albeit there are other elements to it. So that we really talked about corporate governance, that framework of strategic leadership, policy-based decision-making, monitoring and reviewing, and compliance and coverage. And you might have heard the term organizational governance. So how does that fit with, or is it consistent with corporate governance? And I'll answer that question actually with a really brief history lesson about governance and what has traditionally been in the governance role and how the governance role has expanded. So, super high level, we've always had debates about how companies or organizations should be run. And here the example goes back as far as 1602. That's as much as we need to know from this slide. But more recently and through the 20th century, really there was a focus on the conflict between the shareholders who own the company and how directors and managers ran the company. Was the company being run to maximize shareholder return? And so if you go into the corporate theory, there's all sorts of areas of corporate law. You can study the agency costs of running a business. How do you align the interests of the shareholders and the directors and managers? And how do you reduce the agency costs of bringing those interests together? Huge body of research, but I'm sure, no doubt, you're reading that going, that doesn't sound like governance to us, Aaron, how we do governance or what governance is for us. And then, the governance focus on corporate governance in Australia has really been kind of sharpened over the years by a few scandals and a few royal commissions. You might be familiar with the collapse of HIH Insurance, second largest insurer at the time. And there was a huge focus on that because of the resulting loss of shareholder value and ultimately a big corporate crisis around the insurance market. But that traditional focus of corporate governance has always had a strong financial focus. And it's included also things like setting and monitoring strategic direction of the organisation, oversight in the chief executive officer, identifying and managing risk, what's the board look like, and being accountable to shareholders. There's some really kind of traditional foci of corporate governance and that kind of brief super potted history I've given you. But as I said, over time, there's been increasing scrutiny of directors. We had the Hayne Royal Commission in banking. Again, cultural problems, failure of, to follow the basics such as obey the law. We've had the Aged Care Royal Commission, which has looked at the lack of appropriate skills and knowledge on governing bodies. They've said, well, there's a lack of focus on the safety and quality of care and services, too much focus on the money, not enough focus on the workforce. So you can see some of these things are starting to move beyond the realm of what's the traditional role of the board. But these royal commissions are saying, well, hang on, boards, you need to have a bit of a wider view, open up your eyes a bit than just your traditional, what you see as your traditional, heavily financially driven roles and responsibilities. And likewise, in the realm of disability as well, again, a focus by the Royal Commission that boards had inadequate oversight about organisational performance and especially the safety and quality of services. So essentially, I put you, there's been a rise over the years of increasing expectations of what's within the role of the board and therefore their governance roles and responsibilities. There's more risks they have to consider. They've got that obligation to establish and maintain safe environments for staff, volunteers, third parties. The work health and safety aspect I hope you're familiar with. They've had to take on the role of setting and monitoring culture, especially in the health and aged care context. There's been a bigger focus on the safety and quality of services delivered. And that, I think I've demonstrated that through that quick example of both the Aged Care Royal Commission and the Disability Royal Commission. And you can see it as well practically play out in the aged care regulation and standards in terms of there being much more specific about what's the role of the governing body, who's on it, what information does it receive from from consumers, or in terms of quality, how does that use that information from consumers on its quality of services to inform strategic planning, and on it goes. And also in terms of what else has been generally included in the role of boards or governing bodies over the years is really this idea of using customer or family input to inform product design and delivery. And again, you can see some of that practice play out in the aged care legislation, in the way we're meant to engage consumers or their families in care planning, and the way many organisational types now have to also use the consumer advisory committees and the quality advisory committees, diversifying the input into the board and the decision-making process. And so it's these sort of broader governance roles and responsibilities that I often refer to as organisational governance. And it's also the term organisational governance is an attempt to say, well, this isn't just about corporates. This is also about all organisational types that deliver aged care services. So whether you're a local government, state government, community not-for-profit, some sort of church entity, and the list goes on, whatever you are, this is these aspects of governance, especially these ones back on the slide here, about safety and quality of product and services and engaging clients and customers. This is for everyone who delivers aged care services. And so if we extend out our definition, or recall we had our definition of corporate governance, which was about rules and practices and processes, and about how an organisation is directed and controlled, we'd say, well, it's about that, and it's about how the CEO, executives and managers use that authority. But ultimately, our second star document number one, how does it result in organisational performance, including the delivery of safe and quality products and services? So how do you as a board or a governing body, committee of management, ultimately know not just about financial performance in your organisation, but how do you know about performance when it comes to care, delivery and customer outcomes? So this is just a slide, just to highlight a bit more some of those points I was making about what is organisational governance. And just as a quick aside, if this iceberg model represents the past in terms of corporate governance, sort of, it's boards above the line, the CEO and managers below the line, the penguins were expected to sort of sit up on the ice. Now, organisational governance really dives you a lot deeper. So there's this real tension between, if any of you are familiar with corporate governance theory, boards as strategists, high levels, monitor the business, those sort of concepts, whereas the aged care regulator is saying to you, no, you need to know more in depth what's happening in your business, what are its challenges, how does it work? They're expecting more and more of you. And then if we think about, again, as a brief aside, we think about what the aged care standards require you as an organisation to do. They ultimately want you to have governance systems, or what I call organisational systems, whether it be care, finance, risk management, clinical governance. You can think of that systems approach as ultimately like giant ice rods, or rods going through the iceberg. So what happens down below through the system, the collection of data and information, the board gets information about how the organisation is performing. Now, I know I've skimmed over that pretty quickly, and then certainly if you want to understand more about organisational governance and its link to corporate governance and what I mean by a systems approach, there is an ASSPL resource that's not mentioned there, but there's certainly, I know there is one in the resource pack which you can have a look at, and happy to discuss that with you some more. So again, just to quickly reflect on corporate governance versus organisational governance. It's really that point about, well, we're not just leadership and management, but how we are productive and how do we perform as an organisation across a range of domains. And you can see down that bottom definition on the bottom line, performance of the organisation and its services is sort of added to the definition of what corporate governance is. Now, we've got time for questions, and I've run a little bit quicker than I might have intended, but that's all right. I'm really happy to, I suppose, address any further points that people have in particular about anything I've discussed today, whether you want to ask about the big picture or a specific part of that big picture, whether you're interested in aspects of corporate governance and the role of the board, because really what we're going to do next week, on Thursday, is say, well, we know there's the big picture, we know what the role of the board is, or the governing body, therefore, how do they apply that role, or what should they be doing given the challenges and opportunities for our organisation? And I'll cover that more in depth next week. But if you want to talk about any questions now, whether it's in the chat or come off mute, certainly happy to engage in a conversation about any aspects of what we talked about today. Might be a question about how it impacts your organisation, or how you're practically seeing the aged care big picture put pressure on your organisation, anything like that.
I'm happy to ask a question.
Yeah, go, Alex.
First of all, thank you, Aaron. That was very comprehensive. I suspect my question might be relevant to a fair few people here. It's about how we motivate our boards to come along with this. Like there are, we've got directors that are great. They're volunteer directors. Um, Occasionally we get messages that they understand the changes, the enormity, and what's required, but in practice, that's not really coming through. So it's just a sort of a pragmatic sort of thing about how we what we can do to really motivate them to understand this better.
Yeah, and I think it's a really common question, Alex, especially honestly in the sort of the more community NFP space where directors see themselves, as volunteers and giving their time. But really, meanwhile, as I've been talking about, there's kind of expectations on them and the requirements of what they do are increasing. But they're still very much in that kind of volunteer mode of mentality. And I mean, the best success, Mike and I have had in terms of getting directors or community management members, whatever it is, on board is really about leading them through a process of engagement education about, well, what actually is your role and how has it changed? Now, whether that's with someone like myself or whether it's through the papers and what you put up to the board is ultimately something to make a call about how you can best engage your board. But just increasingly really sending home that message about, well, this is the role of the board, how are you feeling that, and really essentially pushing them to ask themselves and have that conversation about, well, how well are we actually doing? Because really we're sort of starting to touch a little bit on some of the material in the second session, which is fine. And we'll talk about some of those things more. But, often things like whether it's some sort of governance review or whether you take a review of the standards, but really focus on, the current standard 8 or the new standard 2. How do you use those as a bit of vehicle to ultimately engage, not just tell directors, but engage and educate them on their roles and responsibilities so you get that understanding. And as part of any process, I'd always be looking to say, well, who are the 1 or 2 or 3 key leaders in the governing body? Because there's ultimately only always a couple who are the real sort of movers and shakers. And where do they sit on this issue? Are they, is it the chair who's really setting the tone and is in control? And how seriously do they take and understand their roles and responsibilities? Or are there others I can work with to sort of strengthen them in the conversation in the boardroom? So I hope that helps, but we can cover that a bit more next week as well.
Thank you. Yes, it does.
Kylie.
Hi. Thanks. Aaron, there's a fine line between informing your board and crossing that line into too much on their part of then entering into the operational side. So I find that a very fine line that I need to walk, because to keep them engaged means keeping them informed, keeping them as part of what's happening. But then at the same time, then I get all these questions that I don't, to be honest, want to explain because it's in my delegation and I've already made the decision. I'm just reporting. So then I get all this, dialogue around the table that I then have to feel like I have to trim and prune so that they go, and it sounds disrespectful and I don't mean it disrespectfully, that they just go back to their position. So what are some advice or some tools or some resources that you might be able to give us to help us manage the engaging, informing, and to the board without crossing into that operational area?
And just as a starting point, Kylie, what I hear you talking about is what I mentioned briefly before. It's sort of this tension between kind of flying the helicopter, setting the strategy, and having assurance that organisation performance is as it should be, versus, now we're actually down in the weeds and we're making decisions about you know, how to cut the grass, when to cut the grass, who's cutting the grass, and all those things. And yeah, you're right, because especially because what the aged care regulator requires of you in terms of information given to the governing body, I think naturally draws people there. So in terms of how do we practically go about, I suppose, you know, respectfully staying or understanding our lanes, and I've already sort of covered that briefly with Alex in terms of, well, does the board understand its lane? That'd be my first question. But then number two is, how do we help them stay in their lane and work sort of, you know, productively with you, you know, as a CEO or a general manager, whatever your position is. And part of that, a big part of that we find is how information is presented. So, you know, if you just draw an analogy, if you give them wheat, you give them a high amount of detail, what are they going to do? They're going to peck at it.
Yeah.
And then maybe you feel pecked to death, you know, with all those questions.
Yeah, I've given them 3 choices. I like all choices. I only give the choices that I'm happy with. That one are financial. You know, I mean, let's be frank. So you've already, you know, as the CEO, you've explored all these things, but you want to give them some strategic direction, some responsibility, so that, you know, they are all 3 options I like, all 3 options I can do, all 3 options are in the budget. There might be one that might not be, so it's like I might be asking them to dig into a little bit of retained funds for that. But yeah, it is. I like your analogy. So keep going with the wheat.
Yeah.
So
if you give them more typically, if you give them the big meatier decisions, that and set the tone of the conversation, which needs to be done with the chair in terms of framing the meeting and the agenda and the focus. You know, if you throw the meat and they'll fly like eagles is the second part of the analogy. So, you know, you obviously you sort of need to go and ask, am I providing wheat or am I providing meat? In presenting information. The other thing to do as well, I think, is to actually, if you have some sort of set governance review or regular cycle of that, I've seen a lot of success where we haven't just reviewed, you know, sort of the compliance, the documents, the forms we use, but take an approach of how do we focus on we as a board fulfill our strategic leadership, and can we do strategy better? Because ultimately it's really easy, again, in the governance space to sort of fall into the tick box exercise. So how do we do strategy, and do we have the right people on the board to do strategy? Because ultimately, if this is just an example, but, you know, say I'm a neurosurgeon. What am I? I'm highly detailed and process driven, and that's the way I'm used to thinking and working. So you put me in any environment, what am I going to do? I'm probably going to get highly detailed and want to know about all the little, you know, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So do we have the right mix in our board? Now that's ultimately a longer term question, because you as a CEO or a GM can't change the board composition overnight. But if you've got a productive relationship with your chair and your board, you're in a good position to sort of governance review process or the director recruitment process, sort of provide them with information and ideas about how do we strengthen the board from a strategy perspective or governance roles and responsibilities perspective. So they're just ideas.
Yep. No, good. I like the analogy. Thank you.
All right, Joanne.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Aaron. That was very informative, quite timely, I think, too. Just my concern is, as you said, the increasing needs of the clients that are coming to our services, and the amount of energy and time and support, which we're happy to do, that we're needing now to best support people to remain living at home independently. There's a lot more time and admin and hours that goes into that space, which is fantastic. On the other end, we're not seeing the funding to support those clients. So we're getting a higher end of the spectrum of need, but not getting the funding to do the job as well as we could be. And everything's increasing. So I don't know how we're going to manage to keep up with all the expectations, and the most recent one being paying to administer a portable superannuation scheme, which I 100% support. But we're already doing that as a not-for-profit who are independently audited, putting that liability away and making sure every year in our accounts that's been provided for. but now we're going to pay the government to do it another 1.7% of the total payroll, which it's just another brick, really.
I mean, ultimately, sort of what I hear you talking about, Joanne, is sort of saying like, what's honestly our organisation's long-term viability and sustainability. You probably had a business model and a way of operating at some point was probably successful and on the funding, you know, had a set return. But over time, as the rules increase and the funding decreases or doesn't increase as much as the increased cost, that business model can't be delivered in the same way with the same return. So for me, it's ultimately a strategy question of how do we ensure our survival? You know, do we have to grow and go on our own? And there's some new service and business and financial model behind that. Is it some sort of partnership approach? Is it a merger and amalgamation? Like how do we secure our future in the context of the government reform? And you've mentioned some very specific drivers within the external environment. So it's certainly a challenge, and I suppose there's no kind of silver bullet or one answer I can give on a webinar like this. But ultimately, to me, it's about how do we, as a board and leadership team, engage in this big question about how do we ensure the ongoing viability of our organisation. And that may honestly mean, well, it's not just us anymore; it's us and some sort of regional approach, and we come together. Because ultimately, from a financial perspective only, what does limited indexation mean? Limited indexation of funding mean? It drives organisations to put a relatively fixed corporate cost over a greater service base, because the return, greater return, the return from a greater number of services to fund the corporate costs, because the government's looking for you to crunch your corporate costs. So, but I can certainly, there's a few resources in another webinar series I'm doing with another CHIS network, the Developing Collaborative Partnerships Network, which is looking at those strategic options and pathways I mentioned about, go and grow, M&A, partnerships or close, looking at that more closely and saying, well, how do we assess ourselves as an organisation and what's the right pathway forward to us? So I can certainly make sure Cheryl and the others distribute that information if you want to look into that idea further.
Thank you. And I do understand the role of, partnerships and amalgamations, and we've been down that path 10 years ago. And I'm not saying that it's not the way to, stay in business, but my concern is we're community organisations built by the community, for the community, from the community. We're volunteer driven, and I think that at some point, if you don't hold on to that and make that the benchmark, we'll lose what we stand for. Because I just really believe that our clients, and all Meals on Wheels services, I know how we all operate, the clients are at the focus of the organisation. Everything we do is for that client, their family, to keep them safe, keep them well at home. So you start to look at the bigger picture, sometimes you lose focus of what we're really all about.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of about that question, and it's a very big question about, well, is the current mechanism, the managed marketplace, actually for better or worse? Question mark. I certainly, agree there's a conversation we have there, but it's a pretty big policy discussion. And ultimately, sorry, it's just left my head what we were talking about. Then saying, recognising, okay, well, we've got to sort of, become more commercial, a bit more corporatized, but how do we not go too far? How do we balance our head and our heart? How do we balance our heart, all the service objectives and outcomes that we want to achieve, and we probably already do achieve, especially with the client focus? How do we balance that with the business objectives and outcomes that the managed marketplace requires of us, the financials, the economics, and how do we bring that together to be a viable and sustainable community business? And again,
with numerous people that we see already falling through the gaps in the current system, I don't know how they'll manage and survive all the changes. It's anyway, that's
very challenging for organisations and people. So
yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the question, Joanne. We've run a little bit over, but that's not a problem for myself. If you've got to go, that's okay. The recording's there. But any one last question before we wrap up for today? No, that's all right. We'll leave it there for today, and I hope to see as many of you as possible on Thursday. There is a separate registration for webinar 2, so have a look in your weekly wind up, or contact Cheryl at Meals on Wheels via email, and make sure you're registered for webinar 2, where we're going to step through, well, how do we get the portal committee to step up, and then this idea of service diversification. So I look forward to seeing you all then.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl.